Chapter 3. Dangerous Liaisons. Part 1. Pico della Mirandola, continuator of Ficino. The perfect understanding between Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, in which they lavaged each other with more or less sincere compliments, did not last long. Apart from the fact they both were of the Saturnian type, suited to penetrating contemplation of theological truths, it is difficult to imagine two people more dissimilar. The son of Cosimo de' Medici's physician, Ficino, was instructed by his protector to translate Plato's works into Latin. In youth he is attracted to Augustinianism, but loses no time in submitting to scholasticism, of which he becomes undoubtedly the most valuable representative in the Renaissance. Burdened by defects, physical and psychic, he was hunchbacked, had a slight stammer, and often fell into fits of melancholic despair, so grievous that he once almost died of starvation. Aside from that, he was the head of the Academy of Chirurgy, and also a priest, which did not permit him to give up the public obligations devolving on him. He resigned himself to leading a healthy and frugal life, to avoiding melancholy by means of diet, walking, music, some ritual manipulations, and astrological magic. The opposite of Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, a prodigious philologist and theologian, had the advantage of youth, noble birth, and wealth. More or less of an extremist, though not lacking in diplomacy, he had his adventures and misadventures. The end of his short life coincided with his conversion to the Puritan ideal of Savonarola. After many tribulations that went on until the death of Innocent VIII, he was pardoned by Pope Alexander VI, but the services he rendered the Church were limited to a long refutation of astrology. His life ended at the age when others are just beginning their activities. Can one assume that when the time came he would have abandoned Savonarola? He lacked the versatility of Ficino, who was capable of all sorts of political turnabouts, but had certainly shown goodwill equalled only by that of the Pope. In principle, difference in character does not always make collaboration between equals impossible. The young Pico is, on the one hand, sufficiently admiring of the Florentine Platonist that a considerable portion of his work is strongly influenced by him, in spirit as well as in the letter. But on the other hand, he often allows himself to adopt a polemical tone, admixed with sarcasm, to stigmatize Ficino's vulgarity in the most serious philosophical matters. As for the Platonist from Chirurgy, who probably saw Pico as merely an exceptionally gifted disciple, a Mirandus Iuvenus, very worthy of his academy, he addresses him in terms whose almost imperceptible irony ends by negating their extreme courtesy. In the long run, Pico must have found Ficino's paternalism unbearable, and his rebellion regarding the interpretation of love as proof of that state of irritated dependency. It is a matter of discordia concourse rather than concordia discourse, for while wishing to give Ficino a lesson in Platonism, Pico, probably unbeknownst to himself, nevertheless remains under his influence. In his excellent book on Pico della Mirandola, Henri de Lubac emphasizes the circumstances of the writing of Commento sopra una canzone d'amore of 1486, pointing out, among the reasons moving Pico not to publish it, a concern not to wound Ficino, whose interpretations the Commento criticized more than once. Ficino, whom mutual friends had doubtless informed of the young man's impertinence regarding him, thought it wise to write in Germain de Genève that, with regard to publishing the Commento, Pico's last wish, repudiating this writing, which dated from his adolescence, should be respected. Ficino's diplomacy, whose purpose is probably to save appearances, perplexes Girolamo Benevieni. The Commento was included in 1519, through the good office of Biagio Buonaccorsi, among the works of Benevieni himself, who, in an introduction blames a third party for his publication, keeping his distance from it by noting that Pico, as well as himself, had written Come Platonico et non come Cristiano. The last respectful passages about Ficino were carefully deleted in the 1519 edition, and the Works of Pico della Mirandola, published by his nephew Giovan Francesco, contained this unexpurgated version of the commento. Another letter from Benevieni, addressed to Luca della Robbia, which appears in an appendix to the Works, again deplores the publication of those inepti puerili. Pico's embarrassment, Benevieni's perplexity, Ficino's indignation, and Buonacorsi's salutary censorship all make us suspect a serious ideological breach in 1486 between the impetuous young count and the level-headed cathedral canon. What was it about? On reading the unexpurgated version of the document published in 1942 by E. Guerin, we are astonished by the violence of Pico's attack on Ficino. A mind unworthy of his difficult task in annotating Plato's Symposium, our Marsilio is accused of defiling the subject of love on which he is working. While granting that Ficino's systematic mind, a scholastic heritage that Pico himself shares, can often irritate his reader, his young rival's aggressiveness can only be explained by personal resentment, since the lesson he thinks he is giving Ficino can be summed up as an almost literal repetition of Ficino's ideas and turns of phrase. By removing from it the purpose to distort, which mostly affects marginal questions without bearing on Ficino's total vision, we arrive at a general account that would have elicited the enthusiastic approval of the Florentine Plato had it not contained the foregoing invective. Since Eros is the tool that helps to traverse the intelligential stages separating God from his creatures, it would be unthinkable to treat the subject of love without first dealing with ontology. Moreover, because humans occupy the most privileged position of all creatures, they are the only ones to contain within themselves all levels of the cosmos, from God to matter. That is why they are also the only beings capable of climbing to the top of the ladder of creaturehood into invisible worlds. This system of successive links of being, which goes to descending levels, is called the Alexandrine schema, and is inherited by Plotinus from the Gnostic systems he attacks. The thinking of the first Neoplatonist comprises an apostrophe, in Latin processio, or estrangement from the essence of being, which humans alone can make good by the opposite process of epistrophe, conversio, or return to being. As for Ficino, the degrees of progression are as follows: God, the angelic or universal intellect, reason, soul, nature, and body. Through its intermediary position, the soul, like two-faced Janos, has some of the characteristics both of the intelligential world and of the sensory world. That is why it is called copula mundi, or nodus mundi, whereas man microcosm, parvus mundus, is vicarius Dei in terra, vicar of God on earth. Pico della Mirandola repeats Ficino's expressions literally in the stages of development of the human being. Man is vincolo et nodo del mondo. He is the hyphen between the world of angels and nature. He has, of course, two bodies. One, called by the Platonists the heavenly vehicle, is the imperishable wrapping around the rational soul. The other, composed of the four elements, is subject to the laws of growth and decay. Man is also equipped with two organs of sight, one directed towards the sensory world and the other towards the intelligential world, the latter corresponding to Ficino's oculus spiritualis. The descent of souls into bodies is faithfully summed up by Pico according to Ficino's commentary on the Symposium. Quote, "Among human souls, Some have Saturn's nature, others have the nature of Jupiter, and so on. And by that the Platonists mean that a soul can be more closely related and in conformity to the soul of Saturn's sky than to the soul of the sky of Jupiter, or vice versa." End quote. We have the impression that Pico is at pains to avoid the unorthodox consequences of that theory, for it makes clear that the sole intrinsic cause of those differences resides in God himself, the unique producer of souls. But right after speaking of the soul's wrappings, he rashly adds that the rational soul descends from its star, which seems to contradict the protestation of faith of the preceding article. Since ecclesiastical censure, which was also to affect Ficino, had also paid too much attention to his own person, we have the impression that Pico here exerts self-censure. This naive cleverness, which induces him to present only partially a subject that Ficino had expertly presented fully and openly, regardless of possible reprimands, will not spare Pico the troubles he feared. We might well see here a prelude to the anti-astrological polemic contained in the Disputationes Adversus Astrologiam Divinatricem. But, in this case, the hypothesis that this document was conceived with the purpose of obtaining from the Curia the pardon necessary to enter the Dominican order and to put on the cardinalate purple seems not without foundation. All the more so since the commento repeats the whole story of incorporation that Ficino got from Macrobius with the descent of the soul through the door of Cancer, the acquisition of the astral wrappings, and the soul's reascent through the door of Capricorn, adding that its astrological physiognomy is justified by the fact that the terrestrial body is formed by the soul. Now, if Ficino accepts the truth of that doctrine which he himself, in a phrase worthy of his duplicity, had characterized in his Theologia as a Platonist fable, it is hard to see how he can refute wholesale all the claims of astrology. To be sure, between 1486, the date of the commento, and 1497, the date of his death, which left his disputations unfinished, Pico had been struck by the thunderbolts of the Curia, subsequently to find peace with the preacher Savonarola. His conversion, however genuine it might be, poses the question of a split between the writings of his youth and the disputations against astrology. After the death of Innocent VIII, Pico was pardoned by the new pope. Having reached the age of reason, should he not try to redeem himself definitively in the eyes of Rome? Lacking the petty mentality of Ficino, who in 1490, quote, found out the birth date of Innocent VIII in order to prepare a remedy for him in gratitude, this is the limit, for having refused to condemn him for astrology. Pico writes to mark the end of the errors of his youth, a huge treatise against astrology, even though it gains him the enmity of Ficino and his adherents. Strangely enough, this time Pico spares the old master, whom he had not hesitated to discredit in his commento. Quote, he had enough discrimination not to confuse the great apologist, whose apostolic purpose was the same as his own, but all the men he believed to be enemies of the Christian faith, unquote. But Lubach does not fail to point out the solidarity between Pico and Ficino that resulted from the condemnation to which the trilogy De Vita had been subjected in 1489-90. Quote, and by those very people who had fought Pico 2 years earlier. End quote. As for the rest of the commento, we cannot but be surprised anew by the violence of Pico's attacks on Ficino. Had he lost his judgment? Did they not both agree that the essence of love is spiritual and that its object passes through the eyes to the inner sense located in the heart? Had they not both been engaged in describing the deleterious effects of amor herios, the phantasmic sickness, so plague-stricken and venomous that it had been able to cause almost incurable weakness in the most perfect and strongest souls? If this discordia concourse between Pico and Ficino could not produce in the former any strikingly new interpretation of love, it is nevertheless to his stubborn will to distort that we own one of the most interesting and persistent themes in the theory of Eros in the 16th century, the mors osculi, or death from love. This theme had a dual origin. Its point of departure is Ficino's phenomenology, with the process of alienation of the subject, who desperately seeks a place to locate his subjectness. It was a syndrome closely resembling amor herios, which Francesco Colonna was able to describe without recourse to Ficino's system. As in most of his interpretations, Pico takes exception to Ficino's vulgar hermeneutics. Rejecting the intersubjective exegesis, he deals exclusively with the death from love as a moment of the dialectic of the mystical Eros. For that purpose, he adopts the symbolism of the Kabbalah, which reveals to us the secondary source of the theme. The Bensica, mors osculi, or morte debatio, that Pico describes in 4 columns is a corporal extinction accompanied by intellectual ecstasy. No one can rise to intelligential life without having first renounced sensory life. But when the soul has left the mortal remains of the body, it will be called to a new form of existence through spiritual regeneration, like Alcestis, who, not refusing to die of love, could rise again by the will of the gods. Making use of the Christian and Kabbalistic interpretation of Shir HaShirim, Pico asserts that the lover is the symbol of the soul, the beloved of the intelligence, and the kiss is the ecstatic union. The oral kiss, bacio, among the postures of corporal love, is the last and most advanced that can appear as the symbol of ecstatic love. Bensica, or morte departio, signifies the intellectual raptus, during which the soul is so firmly united with the things from which it has been separated that, on leaving the body, it abandons it completely. Such was the experience of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Mary, or Elijah, and others. What was this mysterious mors osculi? Pico and his successors give other details which help us define the scope of this mystic phenomenon. It is a terrifying vision of the intelligential world that Pico rediscovers through allegorical interpretation in the fable of Tiresias as told by Callimachus, because he saw Diana naked, which means nothing other than the ideal beauty, source of all true wisdom. Tiresias went blind, lost the use of corporeal sight, but received the gift of prophecy, incorporeal sight. The same thing happened to Homer when in the throes of the inspiration that made him contemplate the mysteries of intellect. And Paul too, after his journey to the third heaven, went blind. The morte debatio, the full and complete contemplation of angelic intelligences, is rapture in heaven, a vacatio during which the body remains in a state of catalepsy, as Celio Agostino Curioni seems to inform us in the appendix of the Hieroglyphica of Piero Valeriano. After very few variations, the description of Bensica reappears in Baltasar Castiglione, Egidio da Viterbo, Francesco Giorgio Veneto, Celio Calcagnini, Leo the Hebrew, Dialoghi di Amore, and Giordano Bruno, Heroici Fodori. With Bruno, we enter the unfathomable arcana of Eros, in which the pure theory of the Florentine Platonists leads to several quite mysterious conclusions. One of these, at least, relates to the dangerous liaisons that Bruno was inclined to maintain all his life, until his death at the stake, to which he consented in order not to contradict his own illusions, brought him ultimate freedom. The smoke had hardly dissipated when Giordano Bruno was almost unanimously proclaimed a symbol of democracy, a strange paradox that crowned the posthumous fate of the man who was probably the most anti-democratic of all philosophers. Part 2. The Ambiguous Gods of Eros. Giordano Bruno, a man of the phantasmic past. Imprisoned in Venice before being handed over to the Roman Inquisition, Giordano Bruno, in his interrogation of May 30th, 1592, relates that after delivering an extraordinary lecture in Paris, quote, "I gained such fame that King Henry III sent for me one day to ask if my memory was natural or magical. I satisfied him by answering and proving that it was not magical, but scientific, of which he himself was convinced. Afterward I had printed a memoir entitled De Umbris Idearum that I dedicated to His Majesty, who therefore made me lecturer extraordinary, with a stipend, and I continue to lecture in that city for perhaps 5 years, after which I resigned because of the civil riots, and, recommended by the king himself, went to England to His Majesty's ambassador, called Seigneur de Malvisiere, Castelnau by name." End quote. Bruno's natural memory being unequal to his artificial memory, he is mistaken about the length of his first stay in Paris, beginning in 1581 and ending in June 1583, after which, under the protection of Michel de Castelnau, he moved to London, where he remained until October 1583. By a strange optical illusion, Giordano Bruno has been envisaged as a herald of the future, Freemason and liberal, whereas this unfrocked Neapolitan monk was, wherever he went, merely one of the last impassioned defenders of the culture of the phantasmic era. This explains his rebuffs in Protestant circles, where he soon found himself worse off than in the bosom of the church he had been rash enough to abandon. Quote, "Neither in London, nor in Marburg, neither in Wittenberg, nor in Helmstadt, nor even in Frankfurt had he met with the liberal and expansive welcome of his dreams. Calvinists and peripatetics had hunted him down mercilessly. He was no more successful with the Lutherans, who should have been influenced to adopt a more hospitable flexibility by virtue of Melanchthon's doctrine." End quote. Only the iconoclasm of youth, which brought down upon Bruno the first conflicts with church authority, remotely resembles Protestantism. On the other hand, all his culture, of which he was so proud, and for which he was somewhat renowned, was in the sphere of the past, of the phantasmic, of mental acrobatics, in some, in the realm of the grotesque, like Giulio Camillo's theatre. To understand something about his works, posterity, interested in them because of his martyrdom, was obliged to eliminate 8/10 of them, all the mnemotechnic and magical tracts. Posterity claimed to be satisfied, for Bruno had been a defender of Copernicus, and even the first to connect the idea of the infinity of the universe with heliocentrism. Yet, a huge gulf separates this Neoplatonic pantheist from rationalists like Spinoza. Grasping how uninteresting Bruno's work was to the modern age, Hegel, who found his doctrine involved and repulsive, termed his philosophy bacchantic, probably an excuse for being unable to read him. All of which proves that, far from being the man of the future misunderstood in his own time, Bruno was misunderstood precisely because, fundamentally, he belonged to the past. Too subtle, too complicated for the new spirit of rationalism. He was the descendant of those who proclaimed the least accessible arcana of the era of phantasms, mnemotechnics and magic. Scandal in London. In London, Bruno soon found himself at the centre of one, if not two, scandals. As early as 1584, in the dedication to Sir Philip Sidney of the Spazio della Bestia Trionfante, he shows himself so sensitive to the wounding and painful discourtesies of which he was the object, that he considers leaving the country. It is certain that Sydney, and perhaps also Bruno's old friend Fulco Gravello, as he called him, played an important part in keeping him there until autumn of the following year. The first scandal was caused by an unfortunate debate between two Oxford doctors that Bruno decided to immortalise in his tract La Cena della Caneri, dedicated to Michel del Castelnau. The two parties indulged in a rivalry cruelly wanting in tact. The southerner, to be sure, was wrong to count too heavily on respect for the laws of hospitality, whereas the barbarian inhabitants of that island, toto orbe divisa, were only concerned with their dignity and independence. Bruno's contempt for the two Oxonians was expressed in such a way, imbued with Greek, but also with beer, that he ended by alienating the sincere friendship of Fulco Gravel, whose name was distressingly implicated in that unprecedented offence, not only against the worthy scholars and the chauvinistic commoner, but also against British lack of civility in general. The scene of the debate is a memorable one. Having cleverly replied to one harmless doctor, a domestic ass, Bruno was taken over by another whose ignorance equalled his presumptuousness. The Neapolitan did not spare this wild ass, a rude pig without manners, whose academic chain should have been replaced by a halter. "Look, be still, and learn," this imposing beast of burden tells him. "I shall teach you about Ptolemy and Copernicus." Of course, Bruno loses his temper, especially as the man seeks to persuade him, while admonishing him to be silent, that the earth of Copernicus occupied a place where in reality there was nothing but a point of the compass. All this must seem very strange if we reflect that England was the first country in which heliocentrism had met with success. In 1576, Thomas Digges, a protégé of the learned John Dee, published a perfect description of the celestial orbs according to the most ancient doctrine of the Pythagoreans, lately revived by Copernicus, in which, according to S.K. Henninger, through an astonishing leap of imagination, he takes the daring position of postulating a universe that is infinite. In fact, Digges does not appear to have defended the same ideas as Bruno. For him, only the empyrean heaven, habitation of God, was without limits, which does not assume the unlimited multiplication of worlds. As chance would have it, the very year Bruno arrived in London, John Dee, the only person who could have understood and appreciated him, left the country. Dee was, moreover, so unpopular that the mob took the opportunity to wreck his house right after his departure for Poland. The missed meeting with Digges also meant a lost opportunity to know Digges's family. He had to be satisfied with the two Oxford doctors which brought about the troublesome scandal we have mentioned. We are told that Bruno acted here as a messenger of scientific truth, but the truth of Copernicus and of Bruno in no way corresponds to that picture we have made of it. If Bruno concedes to that German a certain perception and wisdom, not forgetting, however, to declare that he himself saw neither with the eyes of Copernicus nor with the eyes of Ptolemy, but with his own, it is for the same Pythagorean reasons that had led Copernicus to replace geocentrism by his heliostatic concept, in that Bruno follows in the steps of the divine Cousinos, whose arguments he merely repeats, implementing them with his own polemical passion. Let us not forget that at the beginning of the 16th century, Catholic thinkers like the Cardinal of Bayeux and Father Mersenne, who was not even a believer in the heliocentric concept, grasped the enormous importance the Copernican system might have had for theological imagination. If their appeal found few listeners, it was mainly because of the Puritan attitude, which, through its rigidity in interpreting Scripture, forced the Catholic Church into an equal rigidity in the defence of Thomism. Bruno's cause, which was also that of the Cardinals Nicholas of Cusa and Berulle, was similarly lost on the Puritans, who saw things only from a utilitarian point of view. The Bible is good, their representative Smitho tells us in the Cena della Canary, because it gives us rules and, quote, "The purpose of rules is not to seek primarily the truth of things and of speculations, but the good effects of its practices on civilization, understanding between peoples, and ease of human intercourse, the maintenance of peace and national progress. Often, and in many respects, it is more stupid and ignorant to say things according to truth than according to the occasion and the opportunity." Unquote. The man of the future was not Giordano Bruno, but Smitho, the Puritan. The arguments about heliocentrism, which had great repercussions, had long eclipsed another controversy Bruno had with the Puritans, in many ways a more important one, the debate about the art of memory. Hardly had Bruno arrived in England than he hastened to dedicate to Michel de Castelnau a number of mnemonic writings printed by John Charlewood. The French ambassador must have received this gift with some embarrassment. He had been welcomed in Puritan circles as the translator of a work by Petrus Ramos, a victim of the massacre of St. Bartholomew in 1572. This pedagogue, whose reputation as a Huguenot brought him a warm welcome in England, was the implacable enemy of the old mnemotechnics. Ramos, who turned up his nose at academic scholastic psychology, did not believe in the primacy of phantasm over speech, nor in the phantasmic essence of intellect. The first condition of memory, conversion into phantasm, was abolished. Thenceforth, gigantic constructions of inner phantasms crumbled. They were replaced by an arrangement of the subject into dialectical order, memorizable because of its natural character. Ramos's main argument against inner phantasmagoria is, however, a religious one, the biblical decree not to worship images. The art of memory is condemned for its idolatrous nature. It's easy to understand why the Puritans were ready to make use of that instrument of anti-ecclesiastical battle, which gave the finishing touch to their external iconoclasm by means of an inner iconoclasm. The ancient art of memory was therefore associated with the Catholic Church, whereas Ramos's memory without images was adopted by Calvinistic theology. In London, where Ramos was the man of the day and of the rationalistic future, Bruno, representing an obsolete past, could not expect a favourable reception, especially since other personalities with strong influence in England, such as Erasmus and Melanchthon, had also come out against the art of memory. If Bruno succeeded nevertheless in winning a disciple in the tacit approval of Sir Philip Sidney, he owed that in great measure to the memory of John Dee. Dee had been the professor of philosophy to Sidney, Greville, and Edward Dyer, which perhaps explains why Greville became close to Bruno and why the latter unceasingly dedicated writings infested with the art of memory to Sidney in the hope of converting him to his opinions. Conflict broke out in 1587, but Bruno did not take part in it personally. His disciple, Alexander Dixon, who had published a treatise, De Umbris Rationis, inspired by Bruno's mnemonic writings, was repeatedly attacked by the Reverend William Perkins of Cambridge, a supporter of Ramos. Dixon, under the pseudonym Heius Skepsius, which comes from Metrodorus of Skepsis, originator of the mnemonic system based on the zodiac and also used by Bruno, wrote a reply. His Defensio pro Alexandro Dixono, the prophetic voice of Perkins, was raised again in a scurrilous satire, a warning against the idolatry of the last times, in which these dreadful words occur during the Puritan funeral service for the art of memory. A thing conceived in the mind by the imagination is an idol. The minister's hair stands on end when he reflects that some practitioners of memory, like Peter of Ravenna, had no qualms about recommending the use of lustful images capable of arousing unhealthy passions. Perkins made a point of banishing their perverse art from England forever, acting in behalf of every pious individual. There would be nothing strange about this controversy if Dixon, who belonged to Sidney's coterie, had not had his 2 treatises published by Thomas Vitrollier, the Calvinist who had published Petrus Ramus's first works in England. Furthermore, although Paris is the place inscribed on the title page of the 2 works that Bruno dedicated to Sidney in 1584 and 1585, they were certainly printed in London. Sidney was reputed to be a follower of Ramus, and it was to him that Sir William Temple, also in 1584, dedicated his edition of Petrus Ramus's Dialecticae Libri Duo. How should we interpret this charade? Francis Yates thinks that if Sidney had been a Puritan and a true believer in Ramus, he would not have been able to write the Defence of Poetry, the Renaissance manifesto in England, a fervent defence of the imagination against the moral scruples of Perkins. Taking advantage of his indecision, the 2 warring factions must have tried to win him over. Time was short because the knight died in 1586, perhaps not before discreetly revealing his preference for the Bruno and Dixon faction. The humiliating setback described in Kina was useful to Bruno. Quickly he grasped the situation and submitted to a dialogue with the Puritans. The 2 works he dedicated to Sidney bear the stamp of that wise decision. The second of these, De Gil Eroici Furori, the one that interests us here, cannot be understood without a foray into Bruno's mnemonical kitchen. Without having any immediate connection with the system employed in the heroic furors, the spatio will be of considerable help to us in grasping Bruno's technique and his attempt to adjust to English usage. The spatio propounds an artificial memory in which the place and arrangement, according to the earlier structure of Metrodorus of Skepsis, are in the form of a zodiac, not in the version of the 12 signs or 36 decans, but in the version borrowed from Hyginus, Astronomica, Venice, 1482, of the 48 constellations, already employed by Johann Romberg in his Congestorium. Responding, however, to doubts which might be forthcoming from Sidney and the other readers of his treatise, Bruno notifies them immediately that he does not want to support the foolish system of the constellations. On the contrary, it is a matter of a spatio, of an expulsion of the animals that the absurd imaginations of the ancients elevated to the skies, in the form of a satire on astrology and classical mythology, a satire that could only please the taste of his English public. The spatio tries to pay respect to the fundamental principles of mnemonics. The 48 constellations, set in 46 sectors, are taken over by a retinue of gods, personifications of the psychic faculties, with Jupiter as their patron representing each one of us, who replace them by a cohort of moral entities, positive and negative, varying in number from sector to sector, which entails a rather complicated circular configuration in space. On this, another structure is superimposed, which circulates freely in all fields. It is formed by fortune, wealth, poverty and their innumerable fields. Spatio 2, 2s. Bruno himself explains that there are other possible mnemonic fields, and he outlines 2 of them, which he uses elsewhere. The first, that of the Sigillus Sigillorum of 1583, resembling the theatre of Giulio Camillo, entails the arrangement of forms in 7 planetary fields. The other, which he calls Kabbalistic and might correspond to the Ars Combinatoria, presages a multiplication according to rather sophisticated reasoning, yielding the following series of fields: 1, 4, 12, 72, 144, etc. Having taken the precaution of mocking the fables of the ancients and exalting virtues, he could now preemptively counter the attacks of any Perkins without giving up his art. This procedure, moreover, was tantamount to a semi-conversion to Ramos's point of view, since all the phantasms that formerly peopled the zodiac had been painstakingly banished. Only virtues and vices remained. Mnemonic phantasms. After that diplomatic tour de force, Bruno must have felt encouraged in his enterprise. It was customary for the person to whom a book was dedicated to pay the printing costs, and Sir Philip Sidney surely did not infringe that rule. In concealing his own name, the printer avoided the responsibility of having published the work of a foreigner who had scandalised London, and Sidney's silence on the subject of Bruno, less surprising than that of Michel de Castelnau, on the same grounds of expediency, does not mean that the knight had contempt for the Spaccio. On the contrary, some discreet sign of appreciation must have shown Bruno that he was on the right track. History is silent on the subject, but without Sidney's encouragement and generosity, it is inconceivable that the impulsive Neapolitan would not have kept his promise to leave the country, and would have dedicated his next book to him also, De gli Eroici Furori. In the heroic furors, mnemonics are at the disposal of Eros. The method is already outlined in the second part of the third dialogue of the Spaccio, where Bruno gives a literal translation of the famous passage in the Hermetic Asclepius concerning Egyptian statues. Full of life, full of intelligence and spirit, capable of many important functions, these statues foresee the future, cause infirmities and produce the remedies, joy and sorrow, according to the merits of each in human affectivity or body. Where Bruno gives a literal translation of the famous passage in the Hermetic Asclepius concerning Egyptian statues. Quote, full of life, full of intelligence and spirit, capable of many important functions. Those statues foresee the future, cause infirmaries and produce the remedies, joy and sorrow, according to the merits of each, in human affectivity or body. End quote. This time, the material used by Bruno is made up of phantasmic emblems whose prestige also derives from the Hermetic statues. Are not those spiritual constructions in the final analysis forms used by magic itself? It is true that their use here comes down to memorizing the stages of Eros, but is not Eros itself an anagogic force which produces the ecstatic union of the soul with God? At first glance, De Eroici Furori is a series of sonnets with commentary of the type of Dante's Vita Nova. Like Pico della Mirandola, from whom he borrowed many of the themes of the commento, Bruno does not hesitate to copy certain poems which, according to F. Fiorentino, belong to Tansio Venosa, the main character and Bruno's spokesman in the dialogue. But most of the sonnets are the creation of the author himself, whether they be commentaries in verse on the representations of Eros or poetic expressions of the heroic furors. In the Sigillus Sigillorum, Bruno had already explained the deep reason for ut pictura poesis, the equivalence between painting and poetry. Zeuxis is the painter of internal images in the memory, who excels in fantastica virtus, imaginative power. In turn, the poet possesses powers of thought out of the ordinary, whose source is also spiritual. Quote, it follows that philosophers are also painters and poets. Poets are painters and philosophers, and painters are philosophers and poets. End quote. Indeed, since intellect is phantasmic by nature, the philosopher must be able to manage phantasms, to be a great painter of the spirit. Indeed, since intellect is phantasmic by nature, the philosopher must be able to manage phantasms, to be a great painter of the spirit. Did not Aristotle say that to comprehend means to observe phantasms? The place where phantasms are reflected, as we already know, is the mirror of the pneuma. philosophy, poetry, painting. These are the contents of Dei Rocci Furori. These three stages of phantasmic speculation are so inextricably intertwined that it is impossible to separate them without destroying the unity of the subject. Unfortunately, being incapable, since the triumph of rationalism, of understanding the phantasmagoric of the great artists of memory, we shall have to make a sharp dichotomy between what is possible to grasp with our mere logical, historical, and comparative methods, and that which, to avoid being drawn into the revived mnemonics, we must leave aside after a concise description. The fifth dialogue in Part 1 is a course in the art of memory applied to intellectual processes in 15 chapters. The impressae, symbolising the stages of love's sophistry, are explained in sonnets, which in turn are the subject matter of the prose commentary. To give an idea of the processes utilised by the painter Zeuxis, it is enough to mention the third mnemonic image appearing on the escutcheon of the heroic furor. Quote, "The third door of his escutcheon bears a nude adolescent, stretched out on a green meadow, his head leaning on his arm, his eyes looking up at the sky where, above the clouds, there are edifices comprising rooms, towers, gardens, and orchards. There is a castle made of fire, and in the middle there is an inscription, Mutuo Fulcimor," end quote. Or the seventh of the escutcheons, a sun with a circle inside and another outside it with the motto Circuit, etc. Other impressae, 12 in number, are commented on in the first dialogue of Part 2. One of them opens a dialogue containing the most important substance of Bruno's treatise. It was to images of this kind that the abbot Pluche referred when he wrote in 1748, quote, "Since a picture is only intended to show me what I am not told, it is absurd that efforts should be required in order to understand it. And, as a rule, when I have succeeded in guessing the intent of those mysterious figures, I have found that what I have been taught was not worth the price of the wrapping." End quote. Let us admit that our mentality would incline us to agree that the abbot Pluche was in the right rather than the Renaissance philosophers of symbolic forms. The effort to code and decipher those complicated messages, the ludus serius, whose meaning was found in the mysterious combination of spiritual processes having the purpose of enriching knowledge of the soul, lacks meaning from the time we no longer believe in either the principles or the conclusions of that knowledge. Not only has the wrapping become too expensive, but the parcel itself is never going to arrive. For the images of artificial memory must be understood in their proper mental context, which was spiritual and phantasmic. Otherwise there is too great a risk that they be considered a sort of crossword puzzle, a game lacking in seriousness, which, if the modern researcher obliges, may be transformed into an endless labyrinth where all sense and meaning are lost. Ambiguity of Eros. An Italian scholar recently thought he glimpsed in the title Eroici Furori an allusion to the medieval syndrome amor herios, or heroicus. Now, even if Bruno was aware of that kind of melancholy, as he probably was, he had in mind something else when he wrote his treatise on ethics. In Bruno, heroic love is defined as the antithesis, on the one hand, of natural love, and on the other, of the passive anticipation of grace characteristic of a certain kind of mysticism. First of all, the heroic Eros establishes its positive existence in contrast to the natural Eros, which attracts towards procreation. Its object is a woman. The object of the other kind is God. The same dichotomy separates it from the melancholic state of mind. Quote, "It is not an atrabilious frenzy, but heat generated in the soul by the intelligential sun, and a divine impeto, that makes it grow wings," unquote. an allusion to the myth of Phaedrus and to the wings of the soul, which, damaged by the catastrophic event of our entry into the world, could only be recovered by a few chosen people, in particular philosophers. In some, this form of erotic enthusiasm has as its main goal grace of spirit and control of passion, not corporeal beauty. But with what kind of grace are we concerned? It is not a gift passively awaited and received, but rather the result of active contemplation. Bruno readily makes fun of the saint who, without any personal effort, is transformed into vas electionis. The hero, or even the demon he contrasts him with, is not a vase, but the artisan who makes it. Likewise, the saint is compared to an ass who carries the sacrament, the hero to the divine things themselves. In the former we can contemplate the work of the divine, in the latter the excellence of humanity. In Bruno's concept of heroic frenzy, commentators have seen, quote, the idea of the universal immanence of the divine that leads to a universally coherent conclusion concerning the human will and capacity for awareness, unquote. The feat of the heroic furores is the changing of man into God, the homoiosis theo, E. Garin tells us, and G. Gentile speaks of the sublimation of reason and the progress of truth. All of that, as Pio Cristella has recognised, makes Bruno a worthy representative of Renaissance Platonism, a disciple of the Florentine school of which Marsilio Ficino had been the leader. Yet Bruno's originality and genuineness, hard to classify, explode in joyous fireworks from the opening pages. This time Bruno's victim is Petrarch, representative of the shameful and degrading passion of love. Quote, this vernacular poet who sighed for a girl of Valchiusa, lacking the intelligence to apply himself to better things, cultivated this melancholy assiduously, thereby yielding to the tyranny of base, idiotic and filthy bestiality. End quote. And Petrarch's work is described as a result of this obsessional contemplation of an unworthy object, as the wasted suffering of a sick imagination against whose pernicious influence Bruno fights with all his might. A long quote here. Here we find, written down, bound in books, displayed to the eyes, intoned to the ears, a noise, a bawling, a buzzing of charades, of tales, of puns, insinuations, epistles, sonnets, epigrams, books, prolix documents, violent sweats, lives wasted away with gnashings of teeth to deafen the stars, lamentations resounding in the caverns of hell, woes that stun the souls of the living, sighs to cause the merciful gods to faint. All that for the sake of these eyes, these ears, this blush, this tongue, this tooth, this hair, this dress, this coat, this little shoe, this sun in eclipse, this crazy person, this slut, this stench, this deathbed, this privy, this menstruation, this corpse, which, by means of a superficial appearance, a shadow, a phantasm, a dream, a Circe-like charm in the service of procreation, deceives us by taking the form of beauty. End quote. Page 289. This extreme misogyny, as Bruno very frankly informs us in his dedication to Philip Sidney, is not caused by impotence. On the contrary, he says, without boasting, he has eaten of the forbidden fruit without ever being satiated, for the snows of the Caucasus and of the Rif would not suffice to cool the heat of his veins. But the realm of physical love must be separated from the realm of divine contemplation with a clarity which Petrarch, the repressed sensualist, lacked. The anti-Petrarchism of Bruno represents fundamentally an attempt to relegate to the sphere of pure consciousness the turbid self-satisfactions of the subconscious, which, in Petrarch's work, are systematically raised to a level of intellectual dignity that, from the point of view of the Nolan, they do not deserve. In Bruno's ethics, there is no room for the phantasms of a degenerate imagination. An attitude not without ambiguities. First, because he accepts woman as an object of utility, provided that her use not be accompanied by fantasy. Second, because he himself does not hesitate to hypostasize woman while taking care to keep his distance from Dante, whom he envisages only as a companion of the unfortunate Petrarch. Bruno's feminine hypostasis is not Beatrice, in whom Dante was not able to separate the sphere of the profane from that of the divine. Bruno's unknown precursor seems, in this sense, to be a misogynous mystic in the order of Sanae, for whom the feminine hypostasis of the intelligence has no actual reference. This comparison, though somewhat pertinent, tells us nothing about the historical context influencing Bruno. We must remember that we are in the middle of the Reformation, and that Puritanism, in the timeless meaning of the word, is growing harsher on the Protestant as well as on the Catholic side. To be sure, that a former monk should make no effort to hide his carnal relations is a very serious matter for all concerned. All the same, his attitude is forgivable if he acknowledges the truth of that principle, sacrosanct to witch hunting and enunciated by the tragic manifesto of Puritanism, the Malleus Maleficarum of the Inquisitors, Instatoris and Sprenger. Quote, "Woman is a bane of nature clothed in bright colours." Unquote. Bruno's misogyny is a legacy from his era, combined with the very practical mnemonics of the ex-Dominican, which permitted him to exercise almost complete control over the phantasms of the subconscious. In this sense, the Night of the Infinite epitomizes the most perfect, and hence the least human product of the age of phantasms, a person capable of free will, untrammelled by the turgid forces of his nature, which he has learned to dominate. Like Ibn Arabi's prologue to the Diwan, Bruno's dedicating his book to Sidney is a protestation of innocence, which in his case finally arouses suspicion. Against whom did he have to defend himself, since no one had accused him of having thought of an actual woman? Someone to whom his love poems were addressed? Nevertheless, Bruno refutes this hypothesis so forcefully that he seems to prepare the ground for biographers who, not wishing to be duped by his too vehement pronouncements, will play the easy game of discovering some Beatrice, Petra or Laura unintentionally responsible for the Nolan's size. Bruno first intended, he tells us, to entitle his manuscript Canticle, but he changed his mind to avoid being accused of drawing his inspiration from an ordinary, that is, natural or sexual love for a person of flesh and blood. These various matters aroused the suspicions, fundamentally sound but absurd in their consequences, of A. Sarno, who, in a 1920 article, tried to show that the inspirer of Bruno's love poems was none less than Queen Elizabeth of England, and that it was only later, post-festum, that the author transformed them into lyrical metaphysics by means of philosophical commentary. In fact, if Bruno rejects as a terrible insult the idea that the heroic furors should have been interpreted as poetic confessions of the love for a woman, he immediately excludes from the concept woman, which, alas, he finds degrading, all female inhabitants of the British Isle, toto orbe divisa, who are nymphs and not women. As a matter of fact, toto orbe divisa means separated from the continent, not only in a spatial sense, but also in an ontological one. England is of an alien race with regard to Europe. We have already seen the ambiguity to which this apparent compliment lends itself in Bruno's designs, since he was far from being an admirer of British civilization of the 16th century. Among those nymphs the peerless, the unique Diana, Queen Elizabeth, shines like the sun amidst the planets. L'unica Diana, quale tra voi quel che tra gli astri il sol. Escusazione del Nolano alle più virtuosa e leggiadra dama. Reader's note, I apologise for my appalling Italian. Though not inspired by a woman, Bruno's poems, according to him, were inspired by a goddess, a mistress of nymphs, Diana, who is partly identifiable with Queen Elizabeth. This is all undeniable, but the conclusions reached by A. Sarno and F. Flora is ultimately quite platitudinous. While they think they are cutting a Gordian knot to reach the truth, which essentially must be simple, those two scholars do not realise that they are at the centre of a network of very complicated meanings at the very heart of Bruno's philosophy, as well as of the spirit of his era. At the heart of Bruno's doctrine. Central to Bruno's moral doctrine is Ficino's thesis of the dispossessing of the subject, of the loss and the transfer of its subjectness into the object. To be sure, that applies exclusively, as with Pico della Mirandola, to the state of mystic love, whose object is the deity. Hence the mores osculi, as we shall see, as well as the story of the 9 blind men, which, though a revival, literal in places, of the eclogue Cacaria, of the Neapolitan Marco Antonio Epicuro, takes his inspiration equally from Pico's theory of prophetic blindness, as formulated in his commento. On the chessboard of this artificial erotic memory, the statue of Diana is by far the most important chessman, the queen, literally and figuratively. But this phantasm's function is more than a representation of a distinguished person, in this instance Queen Elizabeth. The symbolism of the English court was welcomed all the more enthusiastically by Bruno because it concurred with his own metaphysics, wherein a female being called Amphitrite, of whom Diana is the manifest hypostasis, plays a primary role. With the characteristics of a queen, Diana transcends not only the phenomenology of the phantasmic Eros, but also the realm of the entire human imagination. Her presence is not the sign of a non-reciprocable love, the love of a poor foreign clerk for the first lady of a strange country, but the symbol of spiritual adventures as well as metaphysical entities. Bruno is perfectly familiar with Ficino's theory of love and also with Pico della Mirandola's commento. Part of the heroic furores is made up of an exchange of questions and answers between heart and eyes, pneumatic organs with a familiar role in the psychology of Eros. However, the new scholasticism, of which Ficino had been the most famous representative, is ridiculed by Bruno in his comedy Candelaio, published in Paris in 1582. The character, Scaramouche, a charlatan magician and astrologer, recites this passage taken almost literally from Ficino's works. Quote, fascination is produced by virtue of a shiny and rarefied spirit, generated by the heart from the purest blood which, sent out in the form of rays from open eyes, wounds the thing beheld, touching the heart and going on to contaminate the body and spirit of the person. End quote. Elsewhere as well, Bruno reveals that Ficino's ideas do not satisfy him. In the prologue of the comedy, he makes fun of contemplative melancholics and their exceptional powers. Quelli, a quae Saturno ha pisciato il giudizio in testa. Without saying so explicitly, Bruno scorns Ficino for his pedantry. That can be explained by the phantasmic essence of Bruno's culture stemming from Ficino's preaching. But While Ficino's writings comprised very exact and often tedious descriptions of phantasmic mechanisms, Bruno's are living descriptions of inner scenarios. Ficino's distinctive peculiarity is scholastic, the use of locutions chosen to express fixed concepts. That of Bruno is mnemotechnic, a very careful and often tedious presentation of phantasms of the artificial memory. The ground on which Bruno and Ficino meet is the style, very precious in both. Bruno having a marked predilection for oxymoron, quite common in the 16th century. Like St. John of the Cross, Bruno uses terms of mystical love. For example, in viva morte, morta vita vivo. The explanation for this turn of phrase brings us back to Ficino's theory of transforming subjectivity. One is not dead because one lives in the object. One is not alive because one is dead within oneself. Another expression applying to this wasting away from love is, of course, the death kiss, the Benisca of Pico della Mirandola, in which the soul languishes by being dead in itself and living in the object. Bruno would not be a true artist of memory if he did not use statues and an appropriate scenario to illustrate this crucial moment in the dialectic of mystical love of the loss of subjectness. The myth that seems to him most suitable is that of Actaeon, the young hunter who, having surprised Diana bathing naked in a spring, was changed into a stag by the goddess and devoured by his dogs. The fable of Actaeon has always been used in many ways. Poor Ovid, who relates it in his Metamorphoses, explains in the Tristia of having suffered the fate of Actaeon, although the dismemberment has been replaced by exile to the Black Sea. Surely he must have noticed something unseemly about the love affairs of the goddess, very likely the daughter of Augustus. In Bruno's time, the story was as well known as in the time of Ovid. The writer who here supplies us with the material to illustrate it is a gentleman from Poitiers, Jacques du Feuilleux, originally from Gatine, a precursor of Casanova and also, though confining himself to mistreating his own wife, of the Marquis de Sade. Du Feuilleux wrote a treatise on hunting, famous in his time, called La Vénerie, printed, followed by the erotic poem Adolescence, by de Marneffes et Bouchet's Frères at Poitiers in 1561. Du Feuilleux was adept at stag hunting, which earned him a Stag's Lament in verse by Guillaume Bouchet, published at the end of the 1561 edition. The stag pleads his case against the hunter and pronounces this final malediction. Quote, "But if you remain zealous in your evil, despising the power and wrath of the gods, may you meet Diana of Cynthus, bathing naked in some fountain, and, like Actaeon, turning into a stag like me, crying under your dog stretched out on you, who will suck your blood until it makes sense. This cruel pain does equal your offence." It is to this story of the hunter hunted that Bruno's famous sonnet of the heroic furors is dedicated. Here we render it in an almost literal translation. Quote, "Young Actaeon, when destiny directs his hesitant and rash deeds, sets free his mastiffs and his greyhounds in the woods on the scent of game, he sees in water the most beautiful bust and face it has ever been granted a mortal, or even a god to see, made of purple and alabaster and fine gold, and thus the great hunter in turn becomes the game. The large and numerous dogs quickly devoured the stag, who used to go with long, light leaps to inaccessible places. Just so am I, who in my thoughts take aim at prey high up, but they turn against me, killing me with their cruel and greedy bites." End quote. In Bruno's poem, it is not the narratives that matter, but the characters. Now these characters are statues of the artificial memory. We must envisage the scene as being a little like a Flemish engraving in the Antwerp edition of the Metamorphoses, a goddess emerging half naked from the water and a hunter changing into a stag and devoured by his own dogs. Goddess, hunter, and dogs are the phantasmic supports of the mnemonic contents described by Bruno in his commentary. Diana is seen as having a complexion of alabaster, lips or breasts of purple, and hair of fine gold. Only her bust emerges from the water, which means that she is endowed with one part that is visible and another that is hidden. The water symbolises the sensory world created in the image of the intelligential world. The visible part of Diana represents the extreme power and performance that mortals or gods can see through the nature and the act of intellectual contemplation. The alabaster of her complexion is symbolic of divine beauty, the purple of active power, and the gold of divine wisdom. The dogs are divided into mastiffs and greyhounds, which is not at all accidental. The mastiffs represent the subject's will, the greyhounds discursive intellect, the dianoia. The game, pursued by hunter and dogs, represents the intelligential kind of ideal concepts which are occult, pursued by few people, captured by still fewer, and not available to all who seek it. Bruno's poem must be interpreted as a picture painted while we watch, a picture recorded forever in the archives of artificial memory. It represents, in a way, the quintessence of intellective processes whose object, the truth, which is also beauty, is also the object of Eros. As in the engraving of the Metamorphoses, the statue of Actaeon, as conceived by the memory, must have the head of a stag to indicate the process of transformation of subject into object. Why and how does the hunter become the game? Through workings of the intellect, which helps us to change into itself things learned, because it forms intelligential species in its own way and adjusts them according to its capacities, for they are received according to the capacity of the receiver, ad modum recipientis. It is only because of the limits of the intellect that the subject cannot embrace the whole splendour of divine truth. Indeed, this phantasmic recipient compels the intellectual world to reveal itself in the form of phantasms. It is not a kind of knowledge, facie ad faciem, of the soul, but, on the contrary, an indirect noimatic knowledge. It is here that the matter of ecstatic union arises. As he advances on the chessboard of knowledge, the helpless pawn suddenly finds himself changed into a queen, Diana, the object of his quest. The intellect is annihilated, thunderstruck. The hunt continues only through willpower, which transforms the subject into the object, for love transforms and changes into the thing that is loved. It is a matter of a hidden ritual of transition from one existential state to another, symbolized by the image of devouring, of dismemberment. Thus it is that large and numerous dogs put him to death. Thus it is that life in the mad, sensual, blind and phantasmic world ends, and he begins to live intellectually, to live the life of a god, to nourish himself on ambrosia and become intoxicated on nectar. If painter and poet have had the upper hand hitherto, the philosopher will take his revenge from now on, endowing the allegory of Actaeon with an explanation so clear that it is surprising it has always been so poorly interpreted. Quote, "It is not possible to see the sun, the universal Apollo, pure light in its best and highest form. It is possible, however, to see his shadow, his Diana, the world, the universe, nature, which is inside things, which is the light within the opacity of matter, shining in the darkness. Of the many who traverse the paths of this deserted forest, there are very few who proceed to Diana's spring. There are many who are satisfied to hunt wild and less renowned beasts, while most of them do not know what to do with themselves, having set their course conventionally and consequently finding only flies." Actaeons are very rare who have had the good luck to look upon Diana naked, to fall so much in love with the beauty of the body of nature, that they are changed from hunters into game. For the final goal of the science of hunting is to come upon this rare and wild beast who transformed the hunter into the object of his hunt. In every other kind of hunt in which the object is special things, the hunter seizes the things. He absorbs them through the mouth of his own intelligence. Whereas, in the case of a divine and universal venison, he opens his heart so widely to knowledge that he is assimilated to it, absorbed by it, integrated with it. From being commonplace, ordinary, civilized and social, as he had been before, he becomes wild as the stag and the desert dweller. In this vast forest, he lives in the lairs of the cavernous mountains, lairs which do not belong to the artificial memory, stanza non artificiosi, in which he admires the sources of great rivers, vegetates in purity, far from the contamination of ordinary desires. End quote. The two fragments that explain the subject's rites of passage to the intellectual state are at pains to state precisely that this passage consists in outstripping phantasmic knowledge. In the sensory world, man is condemned to acquire knowledge only through phantasms. On the other hand, Bruno's great original approach, which pertained to the intelligible world, gains knowledge without the intermediary of phantasms, facie ad faciam, without requiring spiritual mediation between body and soul, since man only lives in and through the soul. It is, of course, a paradoxical state whose strangeness and peculiarity Bruno does not attempt to conceal. Quote, "So it is that the dogs, that is to say, the thoughts about divine things, devour this Actaeon, killing him in his aspect of social and common man, facendolo morto al vulgo alla multitudine, freeing him from the ties of the perturbed senses, from the carnal prison of matter. So it is that he will no longer see his Diana as if through holes in windows, but, having demolished the high defensive walls, he will have become a single eye, looking at the whole horizon. In this way he contemplates it all as being one thing. He no longer sees distinctions and numbers according to the diversity of the senses. He sees amphitrite, origin of all numbers, all species, all causes, who is the monad, true essence of all being. And if he cannot see her in her essence and pure light, he sees her nevertheless through her progeniture, which is similar to his, having been made in her image. Since this monad, nature, the universe, the world, derives from the other monad, which is divinity, the latter is reflected and beheld in the former, like the sun and the moon. This one is Diana, the one, the entity, the truth, intelligential nature in which the sun and the splendour of higher nature shine." End quote. Actaeon. The mnemonic statue of Actaeon is the phantasm of the subject in search of truth, a search in which he uses all the irrational and rational resources of his soul. Like every man, Actaeon is endowed with sensibility and with fantasy, the two means of learning about the external world of nature and the internal world of the soul. Moreover, Actaeon is a social man who takes part in public life with its limitations, its twaddle and its prejudices. The contemplation of the nude goddess is tantamount to the death of Actaeon. He loses all the attributes of the human condition, sociability, sensibility, and fantasy. But death is only the terrible side of an initiation, of a rite of passage toward the subject's intellectual state. This is marked by direct knowledge of the intelligential world, transcending public opinion, sensory information, and noimatic phantasmagoria. Actaeon, the subject, will henceforth be a dead man alive, a being whose existence is paradoxical, since it no longer has existence according to the pre-established states of his species. Fundamentally, the traumatic experience he has undergone has transformed him into the object of his own quest, into the divinity itself. Actaeon is no longer a man, he has become a god. That is why the continuation of his social existence among men who are no longer his like is a paradox. That is why the symbols of coincidentia oppositorum abound in Bruno's work, because he actually envisages the possibility of existence of a man who, emptied of his humanity, can fill himself with divinity without thereby exiling himself completely from his terrestrial abode. Like the subject who loses his subjectness, he is dead. But, like him, he regains existence insofar as, and only insofar as, he is loved by the object who becomes thus transformed into himself. In the traumatic process undergone by Actaeon when he surprises the naked Diana bathing in the spring, the goddess really gives herself, lets herself be possessed, but in the only way possible, by changing Actaeon into a stag, a familiar animal, someone who has left the level of his old existence to attain a form of existence in which he can enjoy his companion, the naked goddess. We can already understand Bruno's presumptions. Let us confine ourselves to the etymological meaning of this word. He states that he himself is this dead man alive, this man liberated from the confines of the human species. He considers himself a religious leader who, like St. Thomas, Zoroaster, St. Paul, etc., has opened the seal of seals, who has been loved by the virgin goddess, the unattainable Diana. In this framework, it is easy to understand that the Inquisition sent him to the stake. Should he not, in principle, have been capable of a small miracle to save himself? And was not the wise and wily Inquisition sure that no one had been able to perform such a miracle? In every witchcraft trial, and I believe Bruno's was one, the passion of Jesus was repeated. Had he not been asked to save himself if he could? Certainly, one of the deepest meanings of Christian truth resides in the fact that Jesus bends to the will of his Father, who decides, rather than save him, to change him into a sacrificial victim to expiate the sins of humanity. Felix culpa, quia tamen ac tantum meruit habere redemptorum. It is not impossible that Bruno envisaged being burned at the stake as the final act of a process which he had developed within himself long before, the rejection of his humanity, the transition to a state of divinity. Do not his last words, which have always been misinterpreted, bear witness to this? Maiori forsan cum timore sententiam in me furtus quam ego accipiam. You feel more fear yourselves in convicting me than I do in receiving your sentence of death. If he sought to be the apostle of a new religion, Bruno no doubt accomplished that wish. His name influenced the spirit and the voice of many a Freemason, free-thinker, revolutionary, materialist, or anarchist of the 19th century. In the place where Bruno's statue now stands, in front of the palace of the papal chancellery, on the Campo dei Fiori, the site of his stake, has remained by tradition the rendezvous of the anarchists of Rome. Unfortunately, all those who transformed him into the champion of their social and political cause misunderstood his work and his personality, only recalling his martyrdom in the struggle against the church. Bruno indeed had become the prophet of a religion to which he would never have approved, whose ideals were, on the contrary, diametrically opposed to his own. He, the most anti-democratic of thinkers, winds up as a symbol of democracy. It is now possible to reconstruct and to understand what Bruno wanted. Far from being a champion of progress, democracy, technology, or ecology, Bruno was merely a thinker who tried to reinfuse vitality into the most sophisticated values, the most amazing in the Western Middle Ages, an attempt which, ending in bloody defeat, would, had it not been for the atrocious end of its protagonist, have remained buried forever amongst the oddities of history, along with the productions of a Giulio Camillo, a Peter of Ravenna, or a Fabio Paolini. Diana. While the statue of Actaeon was simple and univocal, the statue of Diana presents multiple aspects which, though forming an indissoluble unity, are nevertheless capable of being analysed one by one. Thus Diana is simultaneously nature, the moon, and also the Queen, Elizabeth of England. A. Nature. When changed into a stag, Actaeon actually experiences a revelation. He surveys the goddess naked. Now Diana, who is nature, the universe, the world, is the daughter, that is to say, the image of Amphitrite, origin of all numbers, of all species, of all causes. Here is the most complete definition of Diana. Quote, Diana is one, the entity itself, the entity that is truth itself, truth which is intelligential nature, in which the sun and splendour of higher nature shine according to the distinction of unity between the generated and the generator, or the producer and the product. End quote. We must not conclude hastily that this vision of nature corresponds mainly to Bruno's works on magic, or that these works are quite different from the philosophic doctrine set forth in the dialogue De la Causa Principio et Uno. While agreeing that there are perhaps differences in vocabulary between Bruno's treatises on magic and the philosophic work, there is no essential difference in principle and in method. To Bruno, matter is the substratum of the cosmos, and the cosmos is animate matter. The universe without the world's soul, corporeal substance without incorporeal substance, are inconceivable. The only thing that changes is accidental form, external and material, whereas matter itself and substantial form, the soul, are indissoluble and indestructible. The same matter, however, receives various beings, modalities of existence. Matter in its unity, like the Platonic chora, is only perceptible intellectually. Its powers are active and passive. Action, unique and limited, does not coincide with power with regard to specific beings. Action and power are only identical in the first principle, which alone is everything that can be. The universe, Diana, which appears as a simulacrum of primary nature, Amphitrite, is all that can be, since it contains all matter. But it is not all that can be because of the differences between the forms assumed by individual beings. It is only the shadow of the first action and power. In it, action and power are not the same thing, not being the same in its parts. The universe is deployed, explicato, supported, distinct, whereas the first principle is entangled, complicato, uniform, one. Corruption, death, vice, the monstrous, stem from the shortcomings and impotence of things which are obliged to be many things simultaneously, trying to attain being through their power to be, which exceeds action and is therefore realised only imperfectly. But, since it is absurd that something be several things at a time, the individual being only succeeds in exchanging his being for another being. So it happens that the universe, Diana, is the shadow of the universal soul of Amphitrite, a shadow that swarms with beings, but nevertheless can be envisaged as an indistinct unity. To surprise Diana naked is to perceive this shadow, to allow oneself to be absorbed by it, giving up the limitations belonging to the particular state of being. Actaeon, who thought he had a separate existence, finally realizes, while he is still able, that he is only the shadow of a shadow, at one with the whole. B. The moon. Not only the poet Ovid has called the moon Nocturna Forma Dianae, but also the other Romans. Insofar as Diana, who is the universe, also reveals lunar behaviour, Bruno seems to share this belief. Now, let us remember that in heroic furors, Diana is the daughter of Amphitrite. Quote, For the monad that is the divinity produces the other monad, which is nature, the universe, the world, where she contemplates herself and is reflected, like the sun, in the moon. End quote. In the system of this comparison, which does not claim to describe the exact structure of reality, Amphitrite plays the role of the sun, the intelligential world, whereas Diana plays the role of the moon, the sensory world, the nocturnal planet that reflects the sun's light. Amphitrite, a sea nymph raised to the rank of goddess of the sea through her marriage to Poseidon, is another very important figure in Bruno's artificial memory. Amphitrite has two faces, according to the kind of discourse in which she is encompassed. In the metaphysical discourse, she represents the intelligential world. In the political, she is Queen Elizabeth. The first face of Amphitrite is further illuminated in La Cabala del Cavallo Pagacio, 1585. Here, the goddess is a source of spirit, of pneuma. All things come from Amphitrite, who is spirit, and all return there. The amusing story of Honorio the donkey, which carries on the main idea of the dialogue Spazio della Bestia Trionfante, is freely inspired by the moral works of Plutarch. Honorio came from the environs of Thebes. He was a glutton, and one day a common plant tempted him. In trying to get it, he fell into a gully and broke his bones. As he lay dying, he realized that his mind was no different from that of other living creatures, such as man, and when his body was buried, the soul of Honorio, the equal of all other souls, flew to the zenith. Reaching the river Leth, it pretended to quench its thirst, but actually kept intact the memory of its ecstatic adventures. Is it possible to identify Bruno's Amphitrite with Plutarch's lunar Persephone, who is the Queen of Souls? There is probably a connection between them, but Bruno's Amphitrite does not appear to assume too explicitly lunar a character, except in the case where, to represent the Queen of England, she finally becomes identified with her own child, Diana. C. The Queen. Ficino's theory of the externalization of love through the eyes, barbarously imitated by French literature in the 16th century, had a strange and unexpected result. Given that the image of woman is of her who wounds the lover's heart, warlike images and bellicose vocabulary are typical of the female. In Philip Desportes, turns of phrase such as "this beautiful murderess," "my warrior," "my beautiful man-killer," abound. The other tradition, abundantly illustrated by Du Boulay, Ronsard, Grevin, Pontus de Thiard, and Brantôme, transforms woman into goddess, divine, sweet unearthly person, etc. Of course, the two traditions often converge, as in Desportes' verses. This beautiful goddess, not only beauteous, a warrior like Bellona has surmounted me. The exaltation of the regal concept has reached its height. Du Bellay calls Francois I and Henri II Gallic Hercules and great monarchs of the world, eldest children of the gods. Henri II is Jupiter. Catherine de' Medici is the great Juno, his companion. Brantôme takes pleasure in the same kind of images when describing the appearance of a princess. Quote, "The most beautiful, superb, and ample figure that can be seen, with such majestic carriage that she will always be taken for a goddess from the heavens rather than a princess here on earth," or again, "a princess, superhuman and celestial, and in every way perfect and accomplished." This fairy tale atmosphere surrounds everything to do with royalty. At the time of Henri II, the Louvre, rather than the king's house, is a sanctuary where courtesans, poets, and artists worship their deity, according to a rite which we shall see take shape increasingly with time. England, which, in the person of Queen Elizabeth, sees all the ideals of universal monarchy revivified, creates, according to the French model, her own royal cult, formed partly of common elements, but also of individual elements derived from her personal situation. Elizabeth cannot, of course, be called the British Hercules. Another comparison is almost self-evident. Since she is unmarried, tantamount in public opinion to a vocation of perpetual virginity and chastity, the Queen is comparable to every famous virgin, be it Astrea, a Vestal Virgin, Ariana, the constellation of the Virgin Mary, playing also on the phonetic similarity between Beta and Beata Maria. The preferred comparison, and so to say the most perfect, is the one that changes her into the goddess of the hunt, Diana, also known as Cynthia and Belphoebe. The choice, which is only too justified by the character both bellicose and virginal of Diana, raises no question except on one point. We well know that Diana, Cynthia, Belphoebe, etc., is a lunar goddess. Now, what does Queen Elizabeth have to do with the moon? Ancient symbolism supplies a marvellous solution to this. Whereas the sun had traditionally been associated with the papacy, the moon was the symbol of the empire, and vice versa according to convention. In conformity with this doctrine, the Queen of England, who is confused with the goddess Diana, becomes the object of a lunar cult developed by a school of poetry called the School of Night, of which Sir Walter Raleigh and George Chapman were the most famous representatives. Giordano Bruno, a fanatic believer in world empire, becomes, in London, a fervent adherent to the obscure cult of the goddess Diana. But the symbolism he adopts so promptly has a metaphysical value for him that probably escaped Raleigh and Chapman, also adherents. With unbelievable audacity, Bruno, who always remained a great specialist and professor of the art of memory, addresses his chosen public in language that was all too familiar to everyone. The statue of artificial memory that dominates the dialogues written in England is of Diana. Sidney and Greville, not to speak of persons in the know, such as Raleigh and Chapman, associate Diana with Queen Elizabeth, or what amounts to the same thing, had the ability to represent Diana without any special effort, since, in their fantasy, she spontaneously assumed the features of the revered queen. Bruno's allegory, designed to introduce metaphysical ideas and mnemonical personal techniques, also had the advantage of gaining for its author a very good reputation in the eyes of her who had been exalted, the Queen herself. Unfortunately, complicated political considerations, or rather Sir Philip Sidney's disgrace, compelled Bruno to leave the English court without having had time to garner the vainly awaited fruits of his praise. The parable of the 9 blind men. The presence of Diana in Bruno's theatre of fantasy is not the only sign of British influence. Through the intermediary of the French ambassador who had taken part in it, Bruno was probably familiar with the allegory staged in Woodstock in 1575 by Sir Henry Lee in honour of the Queen, related in English, Latin, Italian and French by George Gascon in a pamphlet that appeared at the end of the same year. Henry Lee, the best man-at-arms in Elizabeth's time and a friend of Philip Sidney's, gave an entertainment featuring the story of the hermit Hemetes, who, having lost his sight, regained it as soon as he arrived in the best and most wisely governed country in the world. This transparent allegory, which he had probably read and partly memorised, awakened in Bruno an adolescent memory, the pastoral eclogue, Dialogo di Tre Chieci, or Cicciaria, in the Neapolitan Marco Antonio Epicuro. In the last dialogues of the second part of the Heroic Furors, he freely imitates Epicuro's eclogue, also having in mind Pico's interpretation of the prophet's blindness. The actors in Bruno's parable are 9 blind men, mnemonic statues representing the 9 species of love which, through internal or external failure, predispose to sensuality, including the classic syndrome of amor herios, according to Pico della Mirandola's description. The first is born blind, the second has been bitten by the serpent of jealousy, the third, on emerging from darkness, is struck blind by intelligential light, the fourth lost his sight for having looked upon that light only, the fifth for having wept too much, thus preventing the visual ray from coming out of his pupils, the fifth for having wasted all his vitreous humour in tears, so rendering opaque his ocular membranes, thus no longer able to reflect visual rays. The seventh occurs from the same ailment caused by the terrible beat of his heart. The eyes of the eighth were damaged by the arrows of love shot by some beautiful murderess. And finally, the blindness of the ninth was brought about through lack of self-confidence. What had happened? The 9 young men, full of vitality, implore heaven to help them find love. Oh, may it please heaven to cause to appear now, as in previous happier centuries, some sorceress like Circe, who, by means of plants, minerals, poisons, and charms, had the power almost to restrain nature itself. Their prayer is answered, and a wonderful castle appears on Circe's mountain. They enter and find themselves in the presence of Circe, daughter of the sun, Divus Solis Filia, who strikes them blind. The 9 men travel 10 years until they arrive on the island of Britain, at the river Thames, where they encounter native nymphs and explain their situation. Circe gave them a precious vase which is only to be opened when they have attained exalted wisdom, noble chastity, and beauty combined. A nymph opens the fatal vase, and the 9 men regain their sight and begin to dance happily in a ring, a rida. Their song is a hymn of thanks to kind destiny. A hymn of thanks to kind destiny, which revolves eternally. The wheel changes direction. Over there it is high up. Down here it jolts. Day follows night always. Another hymn then celebrates the sources of the tides of the divine infant, Anadyomene, welcomed to the heavens by Jupiter. This oceanic Venus is another statue of the Queen of England, alluded to in the 6th book of Spenser's Fairy Queen, 1596, a more or less transparent reference to the same English court with its nymphs and its mistress, the Fair One. Circe. Another statue of Brunot's artificial memory closes the series, opened by Actaeon. The statue of Circe the sorceress, herself daughter of the sun and a lunar deity. Moreover, she represents the terrible aspect of the great goddess of nature, Diana. Circe binds, Diana unties. Circe blinds, Diana cures. Giovanni Gentile believed that Bruno saw Circe as symbolizing the Catholic Church, under whose yoke the philosopher had entered into the beautiful region of Campania, and from which he would only be loosened in the land of the British nymphs, where, so to speak, he had regained his sight. In Gentile's time, very little was known about the art of memory, and everyone envisaged Bruno merely as the champion of anti-ecclesiasticism. Circe, however, could not be the Catholic Church, since she is only a statue, a very important one, in Bruno's mnemonic system. It is she who keeps the seal of seals. It is she who presides over magical memory and makes possible various processes through the intermediary of the planetary demons. Whereas Diana represents the universe in its unity, Circe is the mistress of magical processes, whose purpose is precisely to reunite the parts of the world, to place them in relationship to each other. Without Circe, there would be no Diana. The remedy would not exist without the poison.